the speed of adoption is, 3, 4, 5x the speed of
Yeah.
the internet or, semiconductors or, previous personal computers.
Welcome back to another episode of the Build to Finish podcast. Today's guest is a builder through and through. He is the founder and CEO of Curotech, a global software development firm helping companies scale, modernize, and win with technology. He started from scratch and built his way into working with high-growth startups and enterprise clients alike. Along the way, he developed a sharp perspective on what actually works when it comes to scaling a business in a tech-driven. Brian Dainis, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steven. Beautiful place that we're doing this from.
Thank you for proving that people will drive out of their way to come and have a meeting here.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's great to have you here. So tell us a little bit about how you caught the entrepreneurial bug and what made you start your own firm.
Oh man, it's a wild ride. So I'll try to keep the short version, and you can dig in more if you want. It goes all the way back to 2008. I had just graduated high school, ended up deciding not to go to college. I moved down to Florida. I was waiting tables at Applebee's, and the housing crisis hit, and it was just you couldn't make money. Waiting tables because no one was going out to eat. I got a job, 100% commission, selling Verizon Fios door to door, like banging doors at 2 p.m. in the Florida summer heat. Drenched in sweat. Couple days I made some money, but that also wasn't working. So it's just, sort of hustling, trying to do what I could, like stuff with like websites for small businesses and doing, internet marketing for businesses. And that just kind of turned from this little freelance gig into an actual business. And, it just, kind of grew and scaled from there.
Amazing. Well, congratulations on what you've built. We'll get into the details.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you've definitely taken it much further than most first-time entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you built the company from the ground up. What were some of the early decisions that mattered most and some stuff that you would, redo today?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that I had some like brilliant insight at the beginning. I mentioned just a moment ago that I didn't go to college. I had no real, corporate or real job experience previously. That first call it 4 to 6 years of doing this was just me figuring out what the heck I'm doing, figuring out, basic stuff that you would learn, in an entry level position at, a professionalized business, all that stuff that, folks that, had that experience might just know by default. I had to figure out and learn all those things. So I started to develop more of a capacity for strategic thinking and, how to build a business and what direction I want to take it. By 2016, 2018 was when I started to kind of hone that skill. But in those first, 5, 6, 7 years, I was just trying to figure out how to get people to pay me money for services.
Trade some time for dollars.
Exactly. Yeah. And I did have a team, I think within the first year or two, I started hiring the first team members, but, it was still no clue what I was doing back then.
So your firm specializes in a lot of cutting edge technologies. When do you see a company outgrowing their tech stack and not realizing it until it's too late?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting time for that question because we're actually going through a sort of like a repositioning as we grow at Curotech, just hitting a $10 million run rate at this point. The last 4 or 5 years, ICP, our customer focus has been on technology and SaaS companies. You could imagine those companies are, native technology companies.
Right.
They're building software. They're pretty sophisticated. So we're plugging into teams that are already pretty advanced, for the most part. They understand, software development life cycles. They understand how to build and execute good quality technology for the most part. And we're moving into a future where we think that, with the pace of AI adoption, we think that middle market and lower middle market and maybe upper middle market enterprise has been severely underserved for quite a long time. So we're just kind of learning what that new world looks like. But you'd be amazed, like some of these companies we've gone into, you'd be amazed at still running IBM mainframes for mission critical business stuff that if it goes down, they're screwed.
Is the ES400 still around?
I've seen it. Yeah, recently a $1 billion company we just went into running AS400s for their entire business logistics.
I'm amazed sometimes when I go into a retail operation and I somehow manage to see the screen and they're still on a green screen.
Totally.
A modern day store, which has an incredible brand, still has a green screen order entry system.
Totally. It's wild. So we think that there's a lot of that out there, especially in those companies that didn't quite get to Fortune 500 scale and have the pockets of a Fortune 500, but they're a real business. doing serious revenue. They've got serious operations, and they just really couldn't figure out how to attract the right talent and the right people. And maybe there's culture issues in the company that didn't enable them to modernize their technology and keep pace with all the things that have, matured in the technology space over the last few decades. So, throw AI into the mix.
Yeah.
It's been massive accelerator in technology, bigger than, anything that the tech ecosystem has ever seen. The speed of adoption is, three, four, 5x the speed of
Yeah.
the internet or, semiconductors or, previous personal computers, previous technology cycles. What we're thinking is there's like a the way that we're thinking about this problem, there's like a multi-phased process that these companies need to go through. First is just understanding where are you today, figuring out that strategic gap that needs to be closed to get to a modernized state. That's going to look like application modernization, data readiness, processes, controls, governance within the technology areas of the business. So that's like that first kind of foundation that you need in place before you can even start talking about AI. But then there's, once you have that modernization foundation in place, there's all sorts of stuff that these companies can be thinking about around mapping processes, understanding, what their teams are doing inside of the company, what things are repeatable, where AI can be either leveraged for efficiency, automation, or even for improving the customer experience.
How demanding are customers right now to incorporate AI into whatever solution you're building?
There's a pretty wide range of appetites or responses to AI that we've seen. So, like, we still have a lot of, think like growth stage Silicon Valley companies as clients, and they're, Series A, B, C, D, companies with anywhere from 25 to 1,000 employees. And, if you talk to them, it's like, if their teams aren't using AI and everything isn't AI native, it's like get this out of here. Everything's like AI. They're like fully 100% like drinking the Kool-Aid, and a lot of them are doing a pretty good job of using AI within their business to create leverage. But some of it's also just there's a little bit of like smelling their own farts going on in San Francisco with all with all this AI stuff. When you look at enterprises, so let's kind of take away the technology space and just look at the mid-market enterprise, and sort of like forget about the Fortune 500. I think the Fortune 500, some companies are doing it really well. Other ones are just trying to figure out what they should be doing. But if you look at that mid-market enterprise space, the large reaction that we're seeing is CEOs and boards are saying, we need to be doing this. We need to know what our opportunities are. We need to know, what our competitors are doing, but they just have no clue where to start. That's probably the majority of them. There's some that are doing it well and creating really interesting use cases that are rolled out into production and actually creating business value. And then there's some that I've seen that are what you would consider like the laggards that are almost like pessimistic, or they're sort of like they have like a bad connotation around AI technology.
Well, the ones that are doing it right. I mean, you work with people, with startups as well as enterprises. What are the key characteristics of the ones that get it right from a technology perspective, from a methodology perspective? Like, what are some of the common traits for the ones that really win?
So it definitely is a culture. It starts with culture. First and foremost, it's culture. So their business is such that they have a culture of innovation where they encourage their employees and their teams to take risks, to try things. They're not going to get slapped for trying something that didn't work out, and they spent some money, but it was like a risk that was, the upside made sense to try to see if this experiment made sense. The other piece of it is like bureaucracy, so red tape. You're trying to get something done and you have to go get approval from 9 people to get one simple thing done, to purchase a Claude license. It's like that's those types of companies are going to have a much steeper hill to climb
Sure.
than the company that the the technology department can just say, hey, this is interesting. They maybe have to go to their boss and say, hey, can you like put this on your credit card, and then they're signed up and using the technology. Now there's obviously like issues with that. If you're a healthcare system and someone in the tech team's like, all right, let's just take all of our data and put it into Anthropic without any understanding of the data retention policies, like there's obviously like concern and risk there that needs to be considered. But if you have smart people that are thoughtful and they're thinking through what they're doing, that's kind of, I think, the groundwork that you need to do when educating your teams on those things.
Yep, I agree. You brought back horrible memories about the bureaucracies that I experienced when I was in corporate America before I started my own company. Even working with clients and dealing with some of their bureaucracy, I mean, it was just so painful,
Yeah.
so counterproductive. It was ridiculous. Unfortunately, it's alive and well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's amplified now because the the speed at which this is moving and the complexity of these technologies, the black box nature of these technologies are such that boards and senior leadership teams don't understand it. They're out of the loop. They don't understand it, and all they see is red flags and risks and warnings. Their sort of like gut reaction is to
Right.
put on the brakes and understand like what are their competitors doing before they make a move, or what does their general counsel say about this. That's kind of where that first reaction is coming in for a lot of these companies that get caught up.
Yeah, agreed. So, on the topic of bureaucracy, obviously there's a whole bunch of decisions that need to be made around technology. And a lot of companies make a build versus buy decision. There's a ton of off-the-shelf software, but yet a lot of companies have really unique requirements that off-the-shelf doesn't always satisfy. So, what are some of the mistakes that folks make when during a build versus buy decision?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer at a high level, but I will say it's like this is one of those examples where there's a pendulum and a spectrum, and the pendulum always swings. In the early days of the internet, there was not a lot of off-the-shelf technology, so if you wanted to build an e-commerce website in 1995,
Yep.
you had to go build it. There wasn't Shopify. Why one of my advisors is he was the CEO at CD Now, and built that to like a billion-dollar company or something, and they spent hundreds of millions or at least tens of millions building a website that sold CDs. Nowadays, if you want to do that, you can spin it up in a weekend on Shopify, and it's like whatever, $99 a month or whatever to set it up. So there's obviously in that previous era you had to build, and when Shopify's on the scene, you can still build if you want. If you want to go like write a ton of code from scratch, but Shopify's already solved that problem. So there's no reason not to use a platform like Shopify in that use case nowadays. But what's interesting is, tools like Claude Code, Cursor, like these agentic coding assistants are creating so much leverage on developers that a really good developer that fully adopts these technologies can effectively 10x themselves. So if you take, there was this term, in software development called 10x developers before AI. So there's, developers that can produce 10 times the output before AI that their peers could produce. And that was coined a 10x developer. So now if you take,
Interesting. There's actually a book called 10X. I think 10X your sales or just 10X by Grant Cardone. So he talks about 10Xing your company or your productivity. But hey everyone, just a quick break from the show to review the top 3 things that I talk to many founders about that are looking to maximize the valuation during an exit. 1, are your books in order? 2, is there enough growth left in the business for the acquirer? And number 3, what is your sizzle? What is that special sauce that's going to take many years for a competitor to recreate? If you have those 3, you're definitely going to be maximizing your valuation upon exit. Now back to the show. Go ahead.
it's one of those terms that gets thrown around everywhere. It's like, yeah, it sounds good, 10x it. But now if you take one of those like proverbial 10x developers and give them agentic coding tools, are they a 100x developer now? I don't know. But like the things that I've seen our team build that previously would have a single person can build in a week, team of, 5 people would take 3 to 6 months to build previously. It's just completely blown my mind. I think that it's still very early. Like just this year, these tools have gotten to the point where it's that amazing. Just in the last like 2 to 3 months, like Claude, Sonnet, and Opus 4.5. Now we're at 4.6. But just in these last couple iterations of these frontier models, have they gotten so profoundly good that this is possible at this level. But I do think that that pendulum might be swinging back where, if you're going to go spend, if you're a company with 1,000 users and you want to implement Salesforce to run your whole business, so, are you going to go spend like, what is it, 199 times 1,000 in licensing per year, plus whatever the setup cost is, plus, 500,000 or, $1 million or $2 million to a consulting firm to implement it versus if you have like a really good product team in house that can just like stand up and build the features that you need, and it's also best spoke to your exact processes. I think there's going to be more opportunities. More companies might start to think that way. But then you also now you're in the business of maintaining software, so you have to make that you have to make that trade-off decision of do I just want to trust Salesforce to run the cloud and Salesforce to manage the compliance and the security and the high availability and the redundancy, or do I want to be in the business of doing that and have these agentically augmented cyborg developers in my company or through a consulting agency doing that for me.
It's definitely a slippery slope because sometimes it seems like you really get so much more, and like you said, something so much more bespoke to your personal organization if you do it yourself. And with today's tools, you can get it up and running significantly quicker than ever. People just don't realize the long term maintenance that's going to be required, and potentially the technical debt that you're going to accumulate
Yeah.
over years
You're saying for the build option.
for the build
Yeah.
option.
And I think that's like that same sword can cut the other direction where like if I need to implement a CRM, like just a CRM, I just need a CRM for my sales team. I'm almost certainly going to go to a HubSpot or a Salesforce and buy off the shelf and implement it. And they'll roll out agentic features. They'll make APIs available and MCPs available so I can hook it into my other agents. But where it starts to get interesting is where like if you're looking at Salesforce and you're like, all right, well this has 60% or 70% or 80% of what I need, but I'm really going to need to like strong arm this to get it to do exactly what I want. Or this one field wasn't really designed for this use case. I think we can just kind of stuff this information in this field, but it's not really what it's intended for, so the input validation doesn't work the way it's expected. Or when you start having those conversations with your team, or you're like, all right, we're going to buy Salesforce, but we're going to build this other application to do the other 30% that Salesforce doesn't do, and we'll use the APIs to interoperate them. When you start having those discussions, that's where the build conversation, I think, rather than previously, you might have still, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, you might have still said, all right, we're still going to use Salesforce as the base, but we'll build all this stuff outside of it. Nowadays, I think it makes more sense and it's more prudent as a technology leader in a company to start to really consider whether the build option makes more sense.
I totally agree. I had somebody on the show a couple of months ago. His prediction was that AI is going to kill SaaS because it's so much easier to build these types of solutions and functionality these days than it used to be.
Yeah.
And because of all of these, bespoke requirements that folks have, that more and more companies are going to make the build versus buy decision to be determined.
I have a hard time believing that AI will completely kill SaaS.
I would agree.
I think that there's definitely like for like the use cases that are technically viable to build, I think there might be like an oversaturation of SaaS. When you start getting into these like really weird like niche product tools that are like small SaaS businesses, there's definitely going to be a culling. But when you look at the big ones, the HubSpots, the Salesforces, the Workdays, the SAPs, the NetSuites, these big giant enterprise SaaS platforms, or even large SMB SaaS platforms, I don't see them going away. I don't know, maybe like their stock has gotten hit pretty hard, maybe more of a reaction to that commentary, but maybe they do see some revenue decline or some margin decline in the
Yeah.
years ahead. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see what the future holds. So I mentioned the term technical debt for the folks that are tuning in that don't understand what that means. Can you A, define it, and B, when do you think technical debt becomes a liability to an organization?
So technical debt, I'll say what it is first. So when you're building technology, when you're building software, you're making business decisions that go into the specs that design the software. So, the first step you do is you define business requirements, and that gets translated into product requirements. The product requirements get translated into technical requirements at each level. So you have business people making the business decisions, product people making the product decisions, tech people making the tech decisions. So there's a lot of decisions that go into all of that. And then once the engineers actually get the technical specs, they still have a ton of other decisions to make, like how are we going to architect a specific function in the code, or what API layers are we going to use, or what variable naming schema are we going to use, like all sorts of little micro decisions that seem innocuous when you're making them. That oftentimes they can seem innocuous, but later, with the benefit of hindsight, you'll go back and say, "Ah, I wish I like created this naming schema. It would make more sense in the way the application is structured today." And that's like a stupid example, like naming schemas. There's like all these little,
Technology choices, coding choices, like language choices, right?
and they compound. So it's like as you're building software, you have a small piece of software when you start, and then it just slowly gets bigger and bigger and bigger, more modules, more services, more like front end components, more back end components, more integrations. And what you started with at that core kind of gets like all these layers built around it. So those early decisions you make in the beginning have, even if it's like 80% the best decision, but there was like 100% better decision you could have made, that like slightly bad decision just compounds and compounds over time. And then as it compounds, it becomes harder to go back and correct it later. So that's basically tech debt. All software has tech debt. All software that's been like committed and pushed to a repository at least once has tech debt in some form.
The second it goes live, it's already
Yeah.
it's already in debt. How does the company realize that it's actually a liability for them and dangerous?
Um, so I think that like tech debt just automatically gets like this bad connotation. Obviously, it's like, things would be great if everything was perfect, but it would be great if like the streets were painted with golden bricks and, there are rainbows and unicorns all over the world. Nothing's perfect. Like nothing's
Sure.
ever going to be like the perfect, utopia scenario. So I think what technology teams and product teams and business teams need to understand when working together is what are all the trade-off decisions and what is good enough and in production and generating revenue look like. And, that's where sometimes like developers and business people can get butt heads where like an engineering team might say like, well, we got to go back and refactor this whole code base because we made this decision 2 years ago and it's affecting our ability to maintain the code. And then the business people are like, yeah, but we're 3 months late. We need to get this to market. We have customers lined up and we have contracts to deliver. And they both just kind of dig in their heels with each other and they're not speaking the same language. So I've seen that break down quite a bit. And if technology engineering teams can learn to appreciate and understand the business side a little bit, and the business side can learn to understand and appreciate the technology side a little bit, that creates a communication bridge. And this is often done at the PMO layer and at the sort of like product management layer that sort of bridges that, communication.
I see. All right. My favorite section, rapid fire questions.
All right, go for it.
We spoke about this, but build or buy?
I mean, depends. It's a tough one to answer. I'm an engineer, so if I'm doing something, I like to build.
I thought you were gonna say I'm an engineer, build, period. But there are buying options for sure.
Hey, I have a ton of SaaS at Curotech, so we buy tons of software.
Good to know. So for a development shop buying SaaS solutions, speed or perfection?
Speed.
Best investment you've made in your business?
Oh, man, rapid fire. I have to answer quick. I would say investing in people that weren't ready for the level. They weren't on paper ready for the responsibility, but they had the right raw ingredients and they had the gets it, wants it, and capacity to do it components. And just like having that conversation, I believe in you and pushing them hard to succeed. And that's consistently like pushing good people,
Right.
having them punch above their weight has been consistently a good investment.
One mistake that taught you the most?
Hiring the fancy, flashy, management people.
We have a lot in common. Tool or system that you can't live without?
It's Claude Code now. We're going to say Claude in general.
So now that you're taking your company to this level, you're approaching $10 million, which is a huge milestone. The vast majority of founders never make it to that mark. What's one piece of advice you would give a founder starting out to get to that level?
Yeah, so I guess this will probably be more for like the bootstrapped, uh, type people. It's a different world when you're doing the VC model. If the compounding effects of time, you hear about it a lot with things like the S&P 500 or your retirement account, but like in your own business, like the compounding effects of time is really incredible. And the more you learn, the more you do it, the more those compounding effects show up. The crazy thing about compounding is that, when you look at like a compound's growth rate, it's like kind of like the later years have incredible growth. Like a lot of the value is created in the final end of that curve. So it's, just keep doing it, stick with it. You can really compound these
No,
businesses.
great advice. Great book, by the way, The Compound Effect. I recently read it. Fantastic book. I highly suggest it.
You got to check it out.
So we're really going to get into too much detail. So before we close out, why don't you give us some more information about the company, the specific services that you offer, and the technologies that you specialize in?
Yeah, so I'm gonna test my off the cuff elevator pitch here because we're going through this like repositioning process right now. So a lot of what we have done has been, the last call it 5 years, has been augmenting and accelerating technology companies, engineering organizations. And where we're shifting to, we're still going to do that. It's still a huge ICP of ours, but where we're going to shift our messaging and our sales and marketing focus going forward is on modernizing legacy technology within lower and mid-market enterprises, and then helping them activate AI post-modernization.
Okay. Awesome. And what specific technologies do you focus on?
Software development, digital experiences with customers, and business systems of record.
Brian, thank you so much for stepping all the way out here to be on the show. And it's been a lot of fun geeking out with you.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Built to Finish. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do like and subscribe. It helps the show a ton. And until next time.
That's a wrap for this episode of Built to Finish. Thank you for tuning in. For show notes and more details, head over to podcast.stephenpivnik.com. Special thank you to our sponsor, Acresis, offering tailored, high-impact advisory services that help founders get to their finish line with a strategic acquisition or majority investor recapitalization. Catch you next week.